Throughout the course of history, there's been a bunch of people who have shaped our world. Theodore Roosevelt is one of them. There's one thing that sets him apart, however. He was a New York man. Continuing this local New York history series, my goal with this video is to focus on his rise in the state, in places like Utica, before ultimately going global. It's easy to get distracted by his later work. I mean, here's a guy who got the Nobel Peace Prize and the Congressional Medal of Honor. Even being president, a great one mind you, is just one item on his resume. It's no wonder that his New York accomplishments do not get as much attention. But he was deeply connected to this state. It's where he grew up and took his first steps towards a career in politics. He fought against corruption and was willing to put his reputation on the line. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning, when he was born in 1858 to a wealthy family in New York City. He was always fascinated by nature, and as a boy he would roam the forests and fields around his home in Oyster Bay, Long Island. And when he wasn't doing that, he was homeschooled and was very bright. Although he did have a severe case of asthma, and eventually his self-prescribed medication for this was a strenuous lifestyle, which is very him, and focuses on strengthening his body. And eventually he goes to Harvard and graduates in 1880. This is when he decided to enter New York politics, because he wanted to make a difference. Long story short, he does. At the age of 23, he was elected to the New York State Assembly and was its youngest member. He came in at a time when New York politics were really corrupt. You had powerful political machines like Tammany Hall in control, and votes were blatantly being bought and paid for. Think Boss Tweed times. Roosevelt quickly established himself as a reformer and an advocate for common citizens. And one of the first things he did was expose the corruption of New York State Supreme Court Justice Theodore Westbrook. Westbrook was helping a rich guy take over a railway company and manipulate the stock price. Roosevelt was not successful in getting him impeached, but he did make a name for himself as a local hero of the people by exposing the scandal. And by 1883, he was the rising star of the Republican Party in Albany and was elected to a second term pretty easily. His nickname was the Cyclone Assemblyman. And a side note here, the man loved coffee and was later said to carry around a mug the size of a bathtub. In 1884, he suffered a personal tragedy when his mother and wife died just hours apart. And his way of coping with it was kind of like how he dealt with asthma. He went back to Albany and dove into strenuous legislative work and pumped out a bunch of bills. At the same time, a group of reformers known as the Mugwumps were emerging, and Roosevelt aligned himself with the movement against corruption. And it all came to a head in April of 1884 in a little place called Utica, New York, where party leaders gathered to choose presidential candidates. At the time, Utica was a pretty big deal, and the city would frequently host political conventions like this for both parties. I'm going to cover Utica in the next video, so stay tuned, but it was here, on the northeast corner of Lafayette and Washington Streets, that a young, ambitious state assemblyman named Theodore Roosevelt dominates the convention and proves himself as a capable leader. Even though he and the Mugwumps were unsuccessful with the candidate they wanted, the important thing is that Roosevelt proves his leadership skills to party leaders, and that would help him down the road. In the meantime, he decided to go out west for a while and become a cowboy. If his career stopped right here, he'd be remembered as a great New York State politician who fought the good fight, and that'd be about it. But of course, he eventually comes back east after a severe winter wiped out his investment out west, and he helps presidential candidate Benjamin Harrison to win the presidency by helping him to campaign. Because of this, he was offered a job in the Civil Service Commission down in Washington, D.C., where he continues to fight against corruption. He was trying to make sure people were getting positions based on merit, not on who they knew. And after 5.5 years in this position, he comes back to the state and was appointed to the New York City Board of Police Commissioners and doesn't miss a beat because immediately he's launching a crackdown on police corruption. And he did a lot of things like establishing the first bicycle squad and advocates for the use of new technologies like fingerprinting and telegraphs. It wasn't long, however, before he was on the campaign trail again. This time, it was for presidential candidate William McKinley, who won in a landslide, and as a reward, Roosevelt is appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He spoke softly and carried a big stick, and when the U.S. went to war with Spain, he literally got out from behind his desk and personally led a volunteer regiment of the so-called Rough Riders straight into battle. At this point, the colonel was a national celebrity, and was asked to run for governor of the state, which he does, and before you know it, he's living in the governor's mansion. During his time as governor of New York, he signed nearly 1,000 bills into law, enhancing working conditions, advancing park and forestry programs, taxing corporations, and more. If he put his mind to something, he was really a force to reckon with, and thus he was a thorn in the side of party bosses like Thomas Platt. Platt was very unhappy that Roosevelt was not a puppet, and so he plots to remove him in a really bizarre way by booting him upwards into the vice presidency. And boy, does that plan backfire, because less than a year later, the president is shot, and guess who's next in line? Of course, that person was busy climbing in the Adirondacks, and a messenger had to run up the hill to tell him the news. So Roosevelt comes down, goes to Buffalo, where he's inaugurated at 42 years old, becoming the youngest president ever. And the rest is history. America's changing, and he was the right leader at the right time to lead it into the 20th century. He brought a dynamic energy to the White House, and his presidency saw significant changes in areas such as labor rights, conservation, regulation of big business, and more. His presidency was so effective that he's since become one of the most admired leaders in all American history. Let's just not forget where it all began. Have a good one. If you're interested in learning more about Theodore Roosevelt, you can check out the Theodore Roosevelt Association, and you can also physically visit his family home on Long Island, which is now a National Historic Center. Join me next time when we look at the history of Utica.